Right, we are live. Good morning to
Good morning,
everybody.
Maya. Good morning,
Good
everybody.
morning, Timothy. You look great. So you're at the boat show in
I'm
Yokohama?
I'm broadcasting live from the Bayside Marina in Yokohama.
How about that? Well, that's a beautiful view there. So
Well, I never
again,
give
let
up.
me start.
We have this show every Sunday, Maya. Rain or shine.
Rain or yes, or shine. And thank you very much for preparing for the show today as well. You chose a beautiful view. That's really nice. So thank you. I hope that you don't freeze there because I gather that it's quite cold there. Hopefully, we'll be fine. So we're broadcasting live, and this is the Japanese politics room of Japan Expert Insights with Timothy Langley and Maya Matsuoka. As most of you already know, Timothy Langley is the CEO of Langley Esquire. This is a public affairs consulting firm based in Tokyo, which specializes in government relations, strategic communications, and public policy. So there has been a lot of events in Japanese politics this week, and Timothy just told me before we started the live stream that he had prepared really well. And of course, because we don't want you to freeze, Timothy, yes, you can brief us in a shorter time than usual, and then go indoors, and we can continue on Clubhouse. So, without any further delay, the floor is
I
yours.
don't, Maya. I don't know where this sudden kindness comes from you, but I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. You don't know how long it will last, so just take
So
advantage. Yes.
I'm going to. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tokyo, Japanese Politics One-on-One. We come to you every Sunday at this time to talk about what's going on in Japanese politics that's important to you, that makes a difference in what's going on in your life, potentially if you're working in an embassy, a diplomatic mission, if you're working in a foreign capital company, if you're living in Japan running your own business. These sorts of things that we talk about are important, and you need to keep following up on them because they're rather large. Most people are afraid of getting involved in Japanese politics because it just seems to be so complicated. But after getting your head around a couple of the basics that we talk about over and over again, it becomes more interesting to you and you can follow what's going on. So I'm going to talk about what's going on right now today that you need to pay attention to. In doing that, I'm going to talk about what we talked about last week to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today and what's going on in Japanese politics. So if you remember, if you were visiting us last week, Mr. Kishida, his approval rating was really starting to tank 2 months ago, maybe even as short as 5 weeks ago. And it began to creep up. And you might remember that the Prime Minister, even the Diet is in session now, but the Prime Minister left on his first foreign trip. He visited, where did he go? He went to Cambodia and he went to India. And since then, he's been to 2 other foreign countries. He sent his foreign minister off to Poland just this last weekend. And his numbers have been climbing as a consequence of that. Typically in any government, when you're having troubles at home, the easiest way to pick up numbers and support is by going overseas, by doing something in the diplomatic realm, because it's easier to score points there and to attract people's admiration for what you're doing on behalf of them. And so leaders frequently do that, and this has been a tool that Mr. Kishida has used very wisely and very successfully. So his numbers are now in the 60% approval rating, and this is key for him because we're coming up to an election of half of the upper house members in the Japanese parliament. This is in July 10th, and there's a lot of maneuvering that's going on there. As you know, the Japanese political world is dominated by the LDP. The LDP consists of about 6 political factions, and there's a lot of movement going on there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today too. We talked last week also about Mr. Abe and his positioning. Even though Mr. Abe was crucial in getting Mr. Kishida elected as his as prime minister, there is a little bit of tension. Actually, a little bit is not quite the right word, between his political faction and Mr. Kishida's political faction. Mr. Abe's political faction, at 96 members, is by far the largest. It's almost twice as large as the next political faction. So he's very strong, and he's got a lot of people that are in the cabinet doing what the prime minister wants, but also they've got, the background stories and lots of machinations that are going on that people like me love to follow, because it reveals a lot of things about what we can anticipate with policy and how politics moves, what the government is going to do. For example, the yen is now weakening, and some of the things that we talk about on this show indicate where that's going to go. So it's something that we follow pretty closely. The LDP has a coalition partner, Komeito. It is a kind of a background of a religious party or religious group, and this is the political arm of that. They don't really like to say that. They want people to believe, and voters to believe, that it is a political party that's founded on principles that are shared by the religious organization as well. But it is clearly a supporting arm of this religious organization. In any event, it is in a coalition with the LDP. And when the election comes up, there are several seats in the Diet where the LDP has a candidate running for a political seat, and Komeito, their coalition partner, also has a seat. And they've been in discussions more than 3 months now about how they're going to divvy that up. If the LDP is strong, but the Komeito needs that seat to keep a balance of seats in the upper house, sometimes there's some horse trading that's going on there. That's been going on pretty seriously, but now, this week and last week, the other parties are getting involved in it, and also the political factions within the LDP are talking with other political parties too. So there's a lot of action going on there. Some of the opposition parties, so it's somewhat strange. I mean, the United States is a two-party system. Japan is basically a one-party system. It's the LDP. It's controlled Japanese politics in the post-war period almost throughout the entire time, except for a brief stint. And then there are lots of opposition parties. One of the opposition parties, Kokumin, is cozying up to the LDP. So there's some horse trading that's going on there, and it's a very interesting dynamic. You might remember in the lower house election just late last year, Ishinto, the Osaka political party, did extremely well. So there's a lot of maneuvering that's going on politically that has very little to do with what's going on in the country, how the budget is crafted, excuse me, how policy is made. It's mostly just about politics, but it's critically important when you're studying Japanese politics to know who the players are and what the score is, because then people can push their issues, or they can have portions of their issues championed while they give up on other areas. So there's a bit of a dynamic going on with, excuse me, who are the political opposition parties and who are the parties that are supporting the LDP. Excuse me. We also talked about North Korea. North Korea, this time last week, had just launched another missile, an ICBM this time, that really extended its trajectory high. But if it had gone on a lower trajectory, it would have been able to reach even absolutely Tokyo. And I think this is a display by North Korea to show Japan that they are within reach. So this ICBM, a very large one, went high and then landed in the economic zone of Japan for the first time. So this is upsetting to obviously the United States and Japan, the defense ministry here. And since then, since last week, it looks like, according to intelligence reports, that North Korea is also preparing for a sixth nuclear test. So they haven't had a test in a nuclear test for about 5 years. And going back and breaking this moratorium on nuclear testing is upsetting a lot of people. And one of the things that we frequently talk about in Japanese politics and in contemporary Japanese society is Japan is unique in that it has a peace constitution, a constitution that has not been revised, not a word has been changed since it was first created at the end of World War II. And Mr. Abe is hell-bent, but other political leaders are also committed to. The LDP, in fact, is kind of founded on the philosophy of changing the constitution to change the defense posture of Japan, which relies largely on the defense umbrella that Japan enjoys by the United States. But this mix of self-defense and the defense forces here are they're called the self-defense forces because they're not supposed to have offensive capabilities. And changing the constitution allows the Japanese government to have more offensive capabilities. And with what's going on in North Korea, these tests, these missile tests, and potentially a test for another nuclear device, this is really shaking things up. And I've said for a long time that if the LDP does well in the upper house election coming up in July, very definitely the revision of the Constitution will be on the agenda. Doing something like that requires a supermajority in the upper house to vote for that, a supermajority in the lower house to vote for that, and then it goes to a referendum of the people. And if 50% of the people who vote for that referendum that is offered by the Japanese parliament, then it becomes law. And I think you're going to see that with all of this tension that's rising up, it seems to me to be somewhat inevitable, and it seems to be the design of North Korea to continue this march forward. This is completely separate from what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. We talked about that last week too. Last week, the Prime Minister made a rather not strange, it was a kind of an alarming statement about the northern territories and the Russian occupation. So for many years, Mr. Abe has been trying to work with Mr. Putin about developing the 4 islands that were overtaken by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, or just before the end of World War II. And these have been occupied. And he's been trying to get the government, the Russian government, to relinquish that, or to have trade and investment, or to have tourism, that sort of thing. He's been completely unsuccessful there. And now the kind of the tables have turned. Mr. Abe is no longer prime minister. All of that invested goodwill he has put into that relationship is behind, and Mr. Kishida is now emboldened. Mr. Kishida is less hawkish than Mr. Abe was, but we've got Russia going on, we've got Ukraine going on, and he's basically poked his finger in the eye of Mr. Putin and said, you are illegally occupying these 4 islands, and we want them back. And these negotiations, actually the Russians came back and said, the negotiations between this peace settlement, we still haven't signed a peace agreement between Japan and Russia. We're going to stop those negotiations. So it's kind of a tit for tat going on there. So it's escalating on a lot of different levels. We talked a little bit about COVID and the 4th shot. It looks like the Japanese government is moving very briskly in that direction. They will start administering the 4th booster shot to the most vulnerable people, the older, some of the caretakers and the first responders, and that will be starting in April. So today is April 3rd. As you know, everything starts, the fiscal year starts in April. So even children will be receiving booster shots from April now, going forward. And getting on to how important April is, I'm sure if you live here, if you've done much business in Japan, you notice April 1st happens, and all of a sudden you do notice it. The television newscasters change. They changed a lot of their the agendas for television shows and that sort of thing. Everything starts April 1st, so it's pretty interesting to watch this whole shift that happens on April 1st. And we talked also about the change in the juvenile law that took effect on April 1st. And that means previously Japanese kids who became 20 years old were qualified as adults at that point. That means they could sign contracts, they could get married, they could do what they wanted to do because they were considered in Japanese law as adults. They've changed that now to be 18 and 19 years old as of April 1st. That's caused a little bit of concern. So there was a little bit of controversy inside the Diet and deliberations there about being able to protect Japanese kids from being unscrupulously approached on contracts, on signing contracts, on getting credit cards, on purchasing things, because it's a rather big step from 20 to 18. But at the same time, I mean, kids these days, they're really, they should be adults at an earlier age. 20 is a little bit old. It doesn't include yet drinking and gambling, but it does include signing contracts and getting a license, applying for a credit card and that sort of thing. So you can expect that there's going to be a little bit more tension around contracting and protection of the 18 and 19 years old. In line with that, there was a survey that was produced on Friday that reported, I'm sure you will be shocked, that in a survey of Japanese women, the vast majority are talking about a lackluster, robust lifestyle that apparently they had at some point in time, but they don't have now. And this is concerning not only because so much emphasis is being devoted to women's issues these days, but also because women are such a huge potential component of the workforce, and the Japanese government has to do something about that. They have to encourage somehow to an expansion of the workforce. I mean, the only other option for them is to open their doors to more foreigners. And that's somewhat distasteful to a lot of people. And not only that, but even if it wasn't distasteful, it's a hard nut to crack as a foreigner coming in here. The Japanese government has tried it with Brazilians or with Filipino nurses providing health care, that sort of thing. It really hasn't gone very well. The best thing is to have it homegrown. The Japanese people dealing with Japanese people in sales and marketing, in that sort of thing. So addressing this women's issue is a very big issue. And the fact that this survey came out on Friday and was so stark, you can anticipate that the Japanese government is going to be spending time on repairing that. You might remember that before the last election in the lower house, there was also a big push to have children's issues taken care of, because children, they did another survey that revealed that many children were living below the poverty level, and the Japanese government needed to do something. So they put a lot of energy and a lot of effort into that. They earmarked some in the supplemental budget to take care of that. They've had a discussion about setting up a separate ministry or perhaps an agency to deal with children's issues. That is still receiving a little bit of attention. I think as we get closer to the upper house election, that will be more robust, and you'll see children's issues, you'll see women's issues coming up, and that will be affecting policy and also the distribution of supplemental budget. Getting on to what's going on in Japanese politics today that's important to you. You might remember that Mr. Hayashi, who is the foreign minister, he is also number 2 in Mr. Kishida's faction, was sent to Poland this last week to deal with the Ukrainian refugee issue. This is really remarkable. For anybody that's been in Japan for any period of time, the typical response of Japan to refugees, to asylum seekers, has been very, very poor. And in applying for refugee status or amnesty, the typical timeline is 4 years. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Japanese government has opened its doors to Ukrainian refugees. The foreign minister is in Poland to talk about that, and he's actually bringing some refugees back to Japan with him. The Japanese government is doing language training, helping people get homes. The Tokyo government has offered almost 500 houses or residents to refugees. This response is just so remarkable and so out of character to what we typically expect from the Japanese, that is something to take note of. So when people ask you what the reaction or what you think of the reaction of the Japanese government with regard to what's going on in Ukraine, you really have to take this into account. And it's rather admirable, since it is so out of character, and it is something that is, I guess, required across the board with the G7 countries and many of the countries that are suffering from what is happening now in Ukraine. With regard to what's happening in Ukraine and how that impacts Japan, there is a oil and gas consortium between Japan and Russia, basically located in the north in Sakhalin, that supplies a lot of energy needs for Japan. The Japanese government was considering cutting that off as another poke in the nose of Mr. Putin, but they decided just this last week. And Mr. Kishida stood up and said, I take responsibility for this. Japan needs that energy. It's very similar to what's going on in Germany. Germany is really dependent on that, and therefore somewhat reluctant to really slap more sanctions on Russia. Japan is in the same situation. And even in light of that, you've got energy prices that are really rising high, food prices as well. So the yen, if you've been following this, I think it's something that people can't miss. The yen is really weakening. It's weakened like 6% over the last 2 weeks. And that weakening is going to continue. It's about 125 to the dollar now. It used to be about 115. So this is somewhat alarming to policymakers, and it is also somewhat frightening for people who are living rather close to the line of, living from month to month. So prices going up is not a good thing. And when this sort of thing happens, particularly in Japan, since the government artificially supports the price of the yen and the value of the yen, when things begin to crumble, they can only hold it for so long, and then it begins to really get out of control. And I think we're approaching that period now. There's a lot of food shortages, energy shortages, and the tension that's going on in Ukraine seems to be rather a long-term prospect. So you can anticipate going forward that it's going to be a tough summer. As we move up to the election in July, the Japanese government will do all they can to keep supporting the yen, to make sure households are happy and satisfied, and they have hope for the future. Maybe so much hope that they release some of this pent-up energy that's represented in the savings that's just in the trillions and trillions of yen, because Japanese people typically save more of their money than spend it, and the Japanese government needs them to re-inject that into the economy. Also, on two other issues, Abino mask, the masks that were created by Mr. Abe when COVID first hit. They've got warehouses and warehouses of those. Those are now being distributed for free. I think I can hear some people chuckling about this kind of, at this point in time, it seems like a ridiculous fiasco. At the time that it happened, I think maybe he was applauded, but that period of appreciation for him going forward and creating these masks lasted only maybe 2 weeks. So he didn't get much value out of that. Similarly, the LDP wanted to distribute maybe $500 to the older people who were 65 years and older, to help them through this difficult period we're going through. That was viewed very sourly in the Diet as a gambit to get people, the older people who vote, their propensity to vote is much higher than the general population, to get them to love the LDP a little bit more than they might ordinarily by just distributing $500 to them. That was shot down this last week. So I want to talk, just wrapping this up, with the contributions that are going on in the LDP. We talked about it last week. We talked about it almost every week. There are opposition parties, and then there's the LDP and the Komeito. The LDP and Komeito have decided this last week that the LDP is going to relinquish about 6 seats to Komeito. And they're not going to run a candidate in these single seat districts when the election happens in July. Excuse me. In exchange for that, there are 38 seats that the LDP wants Komeito to kind of leave a candidate out of. But not only that, that Komeito will vote for the LDP because they are in a coalition and they are spiritually more alike than the opposition parties. I don't know how true that is, but this seems to work with regard to Komeito and the LDP. It doesn't work so much with the opposition parties, and they're trying to do that. They tried to do that in the lower house election. It didn't quite work. The parties are now negotiating with each other about putting different candidates in different zones and keeping those reserved in exchange for letting that party keep a seat that they're particularly strong at, or maybe it's more valuable to them to keep. That horse trading is going on now. And in addition to that, a lot of people have said, Mr. Abe sure seems very quiet these days, while Mr. Kishida is really starting to take off his approval ratings and him being out in public. His speaking publicly to in press conferences. He's looking really strong. He's seeming dynamic. He's looking very statesmanlike. This is a new thing for him. He's beginning to get comfortable with it. And in the absence of Mr. Abe doing something, he's kind of got a free ride. But that doesn't mean that Mr. Abe is resting on his laurels and that he's not preparing for a fight. So this is, once again, it's interesting because it's within the LDP. They are supposed to be brothers, fighting for Japanese politics and Japanese people. But the reality is that there's a lot of infighting going on there. Mr. Suga, who was prime minister just before Mr. Kishida, who was unique in being a prime minister without a political faction, since he's left office, he has collected a group. It's called a group. It's not a political faction within the LDP, but he's created a group of people who are independently affiliated without an affiliation to another political faction. Some of them are. He's got a group of about 30 people, and it looks like he is going to form or apply for faction status before the election. The idea here is that he would combine forces with Mr. Nikai and confront even Mr. Abe in terms of the number of people in that combined group to challenge the supremacy of Mr. Abe. So a lot is going on. We're going to continue to watch this and report to you. It's a little bit ethereal right now, but the possibility of Mr. Suga forming a group, a more formal group, and coalescing forces with Mr. Nikai is very real. And if that happens, the dynamics of Japanese politics will change drastically. So let's keep an eye on that. That's about it for Japanese politics today. I'd like to open the room up for more discussions. There's a lot that I didn't talk about. So if there's something of interest to somebody in the room that we can delve into, let's go at it. And there are a lot of things that I'm not that familiar with that maybe some of the Japan hands in the audience would like to, educate us on. Maya?
Yes, Timothy, thank you for the briefing. Great insights. We got some very nice comments on LinkedIn and on YouTube as well. So, I believe that we can now switch to Clubhouse only. Could you please do that for me, and then you can get your own microphone there. So
Okay.
I want the ice cream. No, not the ice cream. Sorry. I will finish the broadcasting here, and I'm looking forward to see you on the other side on Clubhouse.
Okay, I'll go grab my ice cream, and I'll see you on the Clubhouse side.
Yes, see you there. So thank you for this.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.